Emily Green, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs. In March of this year, you gave a talk in London about growing up in the Hasidic Jewish community, and I was very pleased to have been able to host that recording on my channel a few weeks ago on behalf of the Family Survival Trust. Now, it was certainly a very powerful talk, and hopefully we can go into even more detail in this interview today. So, how have you been doing, Emily, since you gave the talk in London? Was that your first time ever speaking out, and what has the response been like?
It hasn't been the first time that I've spoken, but I think it was the first time that I had an audience as large as the one I had at Family Survival Trust. It's quite liberating and quite empowering to be able to, speak to an audience who are so supportive and understanding of the issues that are surrounding, my experience. So yeah, it's been great, and obviously putting out the video, seeing the response, seeing the comments, it's really been wonderful from people from all sorts of backgrounds. So very validating, and I'm really pleased to be here today to tell you more about my journey.
Well, before we get into your own story and how you came to leave the Hasidic community, let's just spend a little bit of time on the sect itself. For anyone who is unfamiliar with this branch of the Jewish faith, what are the origins of the Hasidic Jews, and how do their beliefs and practices differ from general Judaism?
The ultra-orthodox community that I grew up in is very much based on the pre-war Eastern European communities before the Holocaust. So all my grandparents and most of my relatives will have come from communities that were in Poland or Russia, and survived of the Holocaust and tried to sort of set up their life post-Holocaust. My parents being second generation, and I'm sort of third generation post-Holocaust survivors. This means that there is that sense of trying to sort of recreate and go back to sort of that lifestyle and that community and beliefs and faith, what was of life before the war. This kind of meant that there's, first of all, this distrust of the outside world, very much a mentality of sort of being very close-knitted. I still call it like the ghetto-like mentality, that sense of being afraid of outsiders, non-Jews, kind of, there's a lot of wariness around, outside influences, and almost seeing that sense of like overcoming and the surviving the Nazis is about trying to have big families and recreating and reliving those faiths and beliefs and the lifestyle that they had before the war. So that's basically the sort of background to that, to the Hasidic community, and very much sort of part of the culture in which I grew up in.
Emily, you grew up in the Hasidic community, and from the very beginning there were high expectations made of you and of all women in that community. Take us through what life was like for you, the rules and regulations, and generally what it was like to be a woman in the Hasidic faith, both before and after an arranged marriage.
Like I said, growing up in the Hasidic community means that you are very sheltered and protected from the outside world. We were not able to read any secular books, watch TV or secular newspapers. The schools that we went to they were not the mainstream schools. They were Hasidic schools that were made and run by the Hasidic community. So my education and sort of the messages I got from home, especially as a woman, was the idea that from a very young age, I would grow up, marry somebody from the Hasidic community. The ideal was for a woman to marry somebody who was very immersed and very much believed in the faith, very devout, believer in God, a servant of God, and as a woman I would be his helper in helping him to achieve his, sort of rising in his spirituality. And as a woman I would be expected to have lots of children, because that was the norm in terms of having, big families, perhaps to replace the lost souls in the Holocaust, and that's a sort of sense of, this is my duty as a woman, being a housewife, being a mother. That was sort of the ideals as a woman, and we kind of knew that was the expectation of where that was going to happen. As soon as I was 18, I knew my parents would contact a matchmaker, and I would be, meet the husband that they would suggest for me, and get married and sort of do what my aunts and my mum were doing as well, having lots of children and running their homes.
Right. So what you seem to be saying is that you're a helper to sort of maintain the spirituality of this particular person.
Yes, Yes. And they made it obviously sound very glorified that, men and women, and this idea of misogyny, for example, I never really understood it until I actually left the Hasidic community. To us, it was always told us we just have very different roles and we are very privileged to have that role. And obviously, that was kind of, we were not less than men, we were just different and had our own roles, had our own domains as such. So that's really how we were kind of very much taught and believed in, I guess, yeah.
Take us through the events that eventually led you to leave the community.
So as I said before, growing up as a woman, as a girl, I always knew that I'll turn 18, 19, the expectation would be for me to marry the man that my parents would have suggested and have lots of children, which is exactly what happened when I was 20, which for Hasidic girl is already kind of getting on because it'd been going on for 2 years. My mum contacted this matchmaker. My father met this boy, really was impressed by his level of learning, his devotion to Judaism. And I met him. 24 hours later, we were engaged. My parents had kind of set this all up. My relatives already knew about it. I didn't feel that I had any choice really. We were also taught very much that marriage is not about love, it's about doing one's duty to God. And if this was a very devout religious man, then obviously I was made to feel very privileged. I was lucky to be marrying a man like this. In reality, I had a lot of doubts and feelings of apprehension. I didn't know this man. I didn't feel like I had I couldn't communicate with him. I didn't feel like we had anything in common. 6 months later, we were getting married. On the actual marriage day, I had this real feeling of dread, really, now I think back. And as the wedding went on, I felt more and more sort of scared. Now I know it's because I was going to essentially be raped. I knew that I had to have sex with a man. I was taught, we were sent to this bride teacher that all Hasidic girls go to, and we were taught about the marriage laws, and we knew that part of consuming the consummation of the marriage was we had to have sex the night of the wedding. That was the expectation, and that fear of like going home and having to be so intimate with a man that I had actually don't know, essentially a stranger. That was the beginning for me of, it's not about being irreligious, but I was deeply unhappy and resentful, and it made me start to ask lots of questions. However, for me, getting divorced or living a life outside the Hasidic community was very far-fetched and just didn't seem a possibility to me. I didn't have any skills, I didn't have any qualifications, I didn't think I'd be able to survive. I knew my parents would never have supported it. They absolutely adored my husband at the time. They thought he was, God. They absolutely worshipped him. So I set about to having children, which was the expectation. 10 months after I got married, I had my first child, the next year my second. By the time I was 29, I had 5 children. In the meantime, I was lucky enough to pursue my qualification in teaching, which was something I felt very strongly about. My parents and my husband and his family didn't support it. They didn't see the necessity. But for me, a life of just staying at home and looking after children just seemed too limiting and depressing. My marriage was also miserable. I hated having to have sex with my husband and being intimate with him. We didn't connect on any level, and which caused me deep misery.
And they told you it wasn't about love, so...
Exactly, so there was a constant conflict.
Yeah.
I used to wake up thinking, well, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do it right by God and be the good mother and the wife. And I tried to do that, but there was always this deep down, and especially when there's this... in Jewish marriage laws, there's once a month. Once a woman has a period, she has to physically separate from her husband. And then after she gets her period, you go to this ritual bath where you have to go into sort of like a swimming pool and dip your body. And then you're like pure, and you come home and you have to have sex with your husband. And that's kind of part of the cycle of Jewish family life. For me, doing that every single month, it just tore away at me. And I just found it harder and harder, not easier. But there I had these little children who I loved immensely, and all those expectations. So a lot of conflict, a lot of turmoil. And then as I was doing my degree, my teaching qualification, I kind of started searching more and more about the world outside. The internet also started to become, at that time, more popular. So through my own kind of rebelliousness, I started researching, reading up, looking at things, watching films, which I always felt guilty about, because as a Hasidic wife and mother, I wasn't meant to be doing that. I realized there's a whole world out there, and I think it started to sort of plant seeds in my mind, there is another life, there is other possibilities. By the time I was 30, I think there was this decision that I don't want to be putting up with having to be married to a man I didn't love anymore. I just didn't feel that was something I wanted to do or could do anymore. I also sensed that my children, who were slowly growing up, they were still young, but that sense that is just going to be repeated. My own daughter is going to have to go through the same experience as myself. In the community, boys particularly, because they are sort of trained to become these sort of devout Torah scholars, they stop their secular education at the age of 11 or 12. So my son, who I thought was very bright, actually couldn't speak English properly. My own brothers till today sound like foreigners.
They just studied the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, isn't it?
And all the kind of books that were written based on that. So there's obviously a big canon of
studies of it, yeah.
But written 2,000 years ago, there's all these texts all in Hebrew which they are studying. But it's nothing that is to do or related to the practical real world of today. So that sense that my son was not going to get that secular education, which for me as a teacher was kind of quite ironic. Here I'm kind of teaching children, and education was my passion, and my own children are deprived of that right which every child in Britain gets to have. So I think there was a sense of, if I don't do this now, I have to do this. And I just thought I wanted to get divorced, which obviously was a very, very big deal in the Hasidic community. A woman with 5 children getting divorced it was something really, really big. But nevertheless, I felt that unless I did something, everything would just stay the same, and I think that sort of history would keep repeating itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the beginning of my process of leaving.
I can only assume that once you'd left, it wasn't all smooth sailing. What happened to you in the days, weeks, and months after departing?
Well, I was lucky that I managed to get in touch with a charity called Jewish Women's Aid, and they had a support worker who was wonderful and gave me a lot of support and advice. Obviously, it was quite challenging I actually had a rabbi I was very lucky, very supportive, who actually helped me with my husband, who refused to leave the house, refused to accept the fact that I actually wanted a divorce, and was threatening to take the children from me and all sorts of terrible things. So this rabbi was actually really supportive and sympathetic, so he really supported me. But it was very, very difficult. There were suddenly rumours about me. People looked at me with suspicion. Overnight, I lost friends and colleagues who were, people I worked with always, and they suddenly sort of saw me with suspicion. Getting divorced in the community, in the Hasidic community, is very unusual, especially having so many children. And when there were sort of rumours that I was going to be less religious, at that point I didn't have any definition of what kind of life I was going to lead outside of my marriage or after my divorce. But I think there's a sense that there's that fear, who knows what I'm going to do now, because I didn't have my husband, sort of controlling me.
They assumed you were going to naturally go down a bad route.
Yes, just the fact of getting a divorce from a man like him, I'm going to do, yes, I think that was the assumption, even though on the outside I still appeared the same, I hadn't done anything different. My family also gave me hell on earth. They were furious, tried to sort of get me to go back to my husband, put enormous amounts of pressure on me, making threats about my children. I think that's, like I said in my other talk, about the idea of, a mother who's not religious enough for her children is seen as a threat. And to them, that's more important than whether children should be with their parents or not. It's religion above everything. So I was facing the kind of real reality of a community who were out to destroy me, in a sense, and do everything to stop me going out there and making my own choices. Luckily, like going back to Jewish Women's Aid, they gave me the number of a good solicitor who, and I did get legal aid, who really, really helped me. So once I went into the secular courts, which was a big deal because as a Hasidic woman, I didn't know anything about the secular courts. It all seemed very scary, an unknown territory. I was a Hasidic girl who grew up very sheltered, so I didn't know much about that. But I think for me, it felt like that was the only option where I could get maybe some kind of, the solicitor saying, well, legally I have a right as a mother and it's not about religion. So I started kind of going court proceedings. And then once that sort of went into motion, that obviously made a difference. However, I was still facing the other side, my ex-husband, who was supported by the community. And that's when I realized that the community as a whole would get involved in something like this, pouring endless amounts of money, getting him the best lawyers, best barristers, and do everything to make sure they put every obstacle in the way to ensure that I would not succeed and that I would somehow lose custody of the children. And I think it's also about the message to other women or other people in the community, you're going to be punished. Like, don't even think about it. There's a sense of fear. And it did. It took its toll. It was very, very difficult. But
and this would happen to any woman who would leave.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Because, like I will tell you about the charity, you know, we still support women who go through doing something similar. It's exactly the same thing. They're faced with the same issues.
They all sort of band against you in a way.
Yes, that's how it felt. It wasn't a battle between me and my ex-husband anymore. It was between me and the entire community. When I was in the Court of Appeal, because my case was eventually appealed, it's a public court. The family courts tend to be private. I saw literally tens of Hasidic people from Stamford Hill who I had no idea who they were, coming to observe and watch this proceedings, which made me realize how much of a big affair it was. There was also a campaign for praying and raising money, which I only found out afterwards. So on a communal level, this idea of leaving the community, especially you're taking children with you, who they saw as like, their spirituality would now be destroyed. So I'm just not only destroying myself, I'm destroying my children's chance at living a spiritual life. This sort of, in a sense, couldn't be anything worse than that.
Would you say that on their behalf, that big mass of people who were campaigning to get you back, there was an element of fear? You know, that you've done something that really shouldn't even be thought about?
Yes, I think so, definitely. And sort of opening that door of the possibilities of what can be done. Yes, definitely. It would open the doors to other people doing it. And the idea that something so terrible...
You'll inspire other people to do the same.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Doing the unthinkable. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. But the irony was that, in a way, at that point, I was still kind of not necessarily sure about my beliefs in God, and I wasn't sure how far I wanted to leave the community or not. But by them kind of taking all those actions, like, for example, I was working at a Haredi school as a teacher I was head of department for 5 years. Through my separation, when all this happened, they asked me to leave my job. Purely on the grounds because I'm getting a divorce. And that made me start to really be like, well, I don't want to be part of a community that behaves in this sort of way. So it was a kind of double-edged sword where they behave like that, but that just pushes people further out. And where I think a lot of people maybe not wanting to leave fully or want to kind of keep some of the practices, I think in that way it makes a big sort of divide between once you've kind of crossed over. It's very black and white, really. You're either in or you're out.
Well, the good news is that now you and your children are doing well. You teach full-time at the Crest Academy in London and have founded GesherEU, a registered UK charity to help people who are in a similar situation to what you had gone through. So what can you tell us about GesherEU?
I think through my process of going through the court system and leaving the Hasidic community, there was a very strong sense that there was no support for the journey that I was on. There were lots of other Jewish charities like Norwood, Jewish Women's Aid, like I mentioned. However, there was nothing that was there to support my particular journey where I was facing all that backlash from the community and I'm going it alone. I actually paid a visit to New York during that time and found an organization called Footsteps and went to visit them and attended one of their events, and having that experience where I was sitting there meeting other people who had been through a similar journey like myself was so empowering and so impressive to see the kind of services and support that they had. It really gave me the passion the inspiration rather, to come back and do something.
I think there's a huge Hasidic community in New York, is that right?
Yes, absolutely, massive, yes. So, the fact that they have something like that in New York, but there's nothing here in the UK, made me feel we have to do something here. And I sort of made that pledge to myself that once I was in a better place, I would do something to sort of make sure that also there was that feeling that if I feel the way I do about leaving the community, there must be other people who also feel that way about the community and don't like what is going on and will want to leave. So as soon as I finished my court proceedings, I set about trying to find grants and funding and sort of trying to set up GesherEU. And we are now 8 years down the line, and we are sort of going strong. We've got already, we're managing to employ people and sort of getting some good funding from some bigger organisation and fundraising committees. So that makes me realise that actually something like this is needed.
Emily, what concerns you most about those growing up today in this sect?
When the men come to the Gesher and they tell me, they are hit in school, or they literally, this boy who's calling me this morning, he wants to do his GCSEs and wants to go to university next year, and it's like, your education is not even like primary school level, and he's missed out on all these. He's 22 years old, he's actually divorced now with one child, and you just think he's lost all those years. And it's just that sense of, these children are being deprived, all of that today in London. So I don't know, I think that's something that needs to be more awareness around, I think. I mean, I know the media have talked a lot about it, because a big part of my court battle was about getting my children to be able to go to ordinary schools, and that battle, again, with the community that they were opposing that, just made me so angry. These barristers, solicitors, they're all fighting against my children accessing, going to normal, doing GCSEs, doing A-levels, going to university. I think that really, I don't know, I think that's one of the things that really get to me. That how they are disabling people by it's very well planned. They know what they're doing, and that control that they have over people in this way, it's just, I don't know, that's something that really stood out for me, I guess.
I'm sure a lot of people will be watching this interview because they've been following the acclaimed Netflix drama series Unorthodox, about a young Hasidic woman who leaves the community and strikes out on her own. I'm pretty sure people will want to know what you think of the series. Do you think it's a good representation of those who are unhappy within the sect?
I think that it is a pretty good representation. I think that's the best that there is out there, really. The people who, did, the producers spared no sort of effort to get the details right. And I think they did a very, very good job of that. They also kind of looked at scenes that have never been explored in film at all, like the mikvah, where I talked about the Jewish ritual laws, with family purity, things like a Hasidic wedding, the boy or the girl when they meet the first time.
That first night together, and
Yes, even like intimate scenes, like the sex scenes. I thought that was brilliant. It was amazing to see that, and the way they really paid so much attention to the detail. I was really impressed. And
the awkwardness that really was done very well. You thought it was sort of like a fly on the wall moment there.
Literally, yes. The actors and the way everything down to the decoration, the sort of pictures on the wall, whether the furniture, the clothes, everything.
Yeah.
It was really. And I think they did a good job of capturing. There obviously are details which they got wrong as well, which can be a bit jarring, because when you come from that Hasidic community, you kind of just know that wouldn't. But overall, I think it got the essence of it, something which had never been done before. That was good. In terms of SD's journey coming to Berlin, I think that's where it kind of got into the film kind of fantasy, which that journey, I felt. The reality is actually it's a lot more challenging than it really is, and it seemed almost a little bit like too good to be true. So I feel like on that side of things, perhaps there's my reservation of like, maybe it's not as real as it could be, and there's sort of things that worked out for SD which is not exactly how it normally works. She goes into a bar, she meets people, she just has sex with men, and then she gets this addition. It's not quite like that at all, actually. The challenges for people leaving are enormous, and perhaps there's another film or other episodes which maybe need to kind of capture more of the reality of what that's like.
Okay, this has been a really enlightening interview, and thanks so much for coming in to talk in depth about your experiences. Now, if there's anyone watching this interview who may be in need of help, perhaps in the Hasidic community or similar group, and wants to leave and is perhaps a little bit frightened, what would you say to them right now?
What I would say to somebody who's thinking about leaving is that it is possible. As difficult and as impossible as it seems, there's definitely a possibility of living a good life out there. It's not an easy journey. It's a difficult, long journey, but there certainly is a huge world and definitely a possibility of living the life that you want outside of the Hasidic community. The Hasidic community is only a small, very minority, part of London, and the sense of that's your whole world. And it is when you grow up in it, but essentially once you leave, the possibilities of the people you meet and the things that you can do and is enormous. And I also think that the idea of having choice and agency over what you want to do, yes, it is difficult, but having that, I think there's no price that you can put on that. Also, I will say there's so much support out there. You're not alone. There's, over the last 10 years, so much has changed. There's so many people who have gone through that journey. So I would definitely say do get in touch, because I just think, and the people in Gesher, everybody, we all agree, we don't look back. So yeah, definitely do get in touch.
Okay, I will leave links to GesherEU in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you once again, Emily, and hopefully we can have you back on Talk Beliefs one day in the future for an update.
Yes, no, thank you very much. It's really, I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today. I hope you enjoyed listening.